Hello and welcome to this edition of Biology Bites. Now, today I'm going to be doing part 2 of killing the myth of why and when bass eat. And this study is going to be going over again bass vomit. Okay, so last time I was focused on easy bass and, showing you ponds and then showing you what to do in big lakes and then showing you a little bit more about what goes on in big lakes and why they're harder to catch. And this part of it just focuses on big lakes, and this is more about habitat and size of bait and type of bait. Kind of what I'm going to be going over in these studies. Okay, so the first study I have shows a kind of difference of weeds and how different types of weeds in a lake can affect how the bass feed or what they feed on. Now, this one study showed that at full pool, when there's lots of weeds around, the bass fed on bluegill and crawdads at pretty much the same proportion. But then suddenly, when the lake dropped and the weeds went away, pretty much gave up on crawdads altogether and focused primarily on bluegill. Obviously, the bluegill were hiding really good in the weeds, and well, the easier choice for the bass was the crawdads. But once the weeds went away and the bluegill moved out, they started targeting mostly bluegill. Now, the next study is also about weeds, but it's about actually two different types of weeds. In this study, they found out when the bass were in milfoil, they ate mostly baitfish. You know milfoil, maybe you don't know what milfoil looks like, but if you don't, look it up, find out what milfoil is, because when bass are in milfoil, they seem to eat baitfish a lot. But then in the same lake, they went to duckweed. And when they did a study on the duckweed, the bass there were mostly eating insects, dragonflies and Dempsey flies. How many of us bass fishermen use insects? Where do we ever go, oh, they're on a good insect bite? But those tricky bass, suddenly in the duckweed, they're eating mostly insects. And the thing is, the baitfish they were eating in the milfoil, there's just as many of them in the duckweed. But that's how weird and finicky bass get in big lakes when they have all kinds of cover and habitat and prey. They decided in the duckweed it was easier to eat insects than it was to chase those baitfish. But in the milfoil, they had no problem chasing the baitfish and finding the baitfish. So, I mean, that right there, see, that's something why ponds and big lakes are so different, because you have a section of milfoil and then a little bit later a section of duckweed, you're whacking the crap out of them on minnows or a baitfish shad imitation or something in the milfoil. And you go, oh yeah, and look at that weed up there, and you go that weed and you can't get a bite. You're like, dude, there's just as many minnows and shad and stuff in here. There must be no bass. No, the bass were there, but for some reason, they wanted insects. Those little buggers. We don't fish insects for bass, but evidently, sometimes, that's what they prefer. Okay, now this next study is on the size of the bait used. You know the old saying, bigger baits catch bigger fish. They've done all these scientific studies with lures and tanks, and the bigger bass prefer the bigger baits. But in reality, through regular studies done by biologists, they find no predator-prey size relationship. Bigger bass do not target intentionally bigger baits. They did a study on a whole section of weeds, and they electroshocked it, and they had similar sized bass. Very few of them had a bigger bluegill or something in their stomach. And even then, they also had smaller medium-sized bass in their stomach, as well as that one big fish. And then other fish of the similar size in that all had just small and medium bait. So the conclusion was that they don't specifically target big bait. They don't really go out of their way and try to eat bigger baits, even if it's a bigger bass. There is no predator-prey size relationship. So that kind of debunks the myth that bigger baits will get you bigger bass, because if that's the case, all these big fish that they shocked should have all had bigger baits in their stomach, but no, the majority of them had small and medium, while only a few had a bigger bait in their stomach. So right there, that's kind of debunked that myth just a little bit. Okay, well, this last study and the last part of this is matching the hatch. We've all heard matching the hatch. You got to match the hatch. You got to match the hatch. I mean, it kind of came from trout fishing more than bass fishing, but yeah, we all hear that. You know, feeding on shad, you want something that looks exactly like a shad. If feeding on crawdad, you want something that looks like exactly like a crawdad. You want a bluegill or something, you want something that looks exactly like a bluegill. Or stock trout, you want something to look like a stock trout. Well, yes, but no. Actually, when they're actually hitting schooling fish like herring or shad, or some type of bigger minnow where they're actually focusing on the schools of them and that, if you actually use something that looks exactly like what they're chasing with the amount of fish they're chasing, uh, studies say that your odds of catching a fish or them choosing your bait over that bait is almost zero. When they're in those schools and chasing those schools of bait fish, most of the bigger fish in that will usually lay off. A lot of the little ones will kind of go and attack it and scatter them. The bigger ones are waiting for something to break off. They're waiting for an individual that's sort of struggling or gets separated from the herd. You know, kind of like the big cats do when they're hunting herds of buffalo or whatever. So actually, the best thing to do is get a bait that looks like them, but is actually bigger or smaller than the prey they're feeding on. And the other thing to do is don't have it look exactly like them. Have it be either darker or lighter or just a different color. Because the odds are, with all that going on and all those baits that look the same, if you have something that's darker, something that's smaller, something that's a little bigger, a little lighter, you know, different colors, that will catch their eye. I mean, they're looking at everything the same, and all of a sudden, like, whoa, there's this white thing there, there's this dark green thing there, or there's this, you know, orange thing there, something that's different, and they go, oh, and it's on its own. They like to attack things individually more than a school, so they see that, and it catches their eye, boom, they're gonna eat it. As I said, most people, oh, they're schooling shad, they're put on their most exact sizes and everything, and hatch the hatch, fish it, and they're like, can't get bites or catch very few or only catch little ones, and they're like, man, they should be all over this thing. It looks just like what they're eating. But you need to match the hatch, but match the hatch a little different when they're schooling. And this could be if they're, you know, schooling bluegill or something like that. There's big mass of them and they're trying something a little bit different. And I've also found that when they're heavily feeding on one type of prey, they're not necessarily schooling, but say they're on a really heavy crawdad bite, like everything you catch, their mouth is completely red, their throat is red, you know they're eating them like crazy. Well, this is another one where I don't go exactly with, say they're black and red, or they're like kind of green and orange or whatever. I usually go to something that's a little bit different color. I might go to a creature or a jig or something that looks like a crawdad, but to me, if it looks a little bit different, it's a different color, a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit bigger, but just different. That's when you get more fish to hit it, because they're so focused on those crawdads or whatever they're eating. They know exactly what they look like, and they know exactly how they move and interact. I mean, we throw our bait out there and we kind of make it look good by bouncing all that, but it's definitely not looking exactly like what they're feeding on. And if they're that focused on it and that's all they're eating, trying to match it exactly, they can tell the difference, they might not hit it. But if you switch it up, make it look a little bit different, if it's something that's not exactly the same color, maybe something that's got some bright in it or something like that, oftentimes that'll catch their eye, and that's what they'll target on amongst everything else they're eating that they're really focused on. So there we go. Those are some more lessons from Bass Vomit. I hope this helps. Until next time.